Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to take you deep inside the story of a man who didn't just build a bank. He built a system. A man whose name still lives in the world's most powerful financial institution. J.P. Morgan Chase. A man who once rescued the U.S. economy. Not with guns, but with confidence and cash. A man who had no official title, no political power, but more control than any president ever had. This is not a story of praise. This is not a story of hate. This is a story of truth, of legacy, of money, of control, of one man, J.P. Morgan. This story will also help you improve your English listening practice because it is told in very easy English, with emotion and power. So make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay with us until the end. Because the story you are about to hear is not just history. It's how the modern world was shaped by one man's decisions. Now let's begin with part 1. And let's start from the very beginning, from the moment J.P. Morgan opened his eyes. Part 1. The boy who hated weakness. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, United States. The world he entered was not poor. His father was already a powerful international banker. But the boy who would one day control America's money was not strong. From birth, J.P. Morgan suffered from chronic illnesses. He had seizures. He had rosacea, a skin disease that made his nose red and swollen. He couldn't run. He couldn't play freely. He was often sick, angry, and alone. His mother, Juliet Pierpont Morgan, was very loving, but also strict. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, had no time for weakness. Junius was a man who believed, you are either disciplined or forgotten. And this belief was pushed into young John Pierpont from the start. While other kids were playing baseball, J.P. Morgan was reading ledgers, learning currencies, memorizing gold prices. At a very young age, his father sent him to the Boston English High School, then to the University of Göttingen in Germany. He was not just learning math. He was learning global finance, foreign languages, and how money shapes nations. And while other boys dreamed of adventures, J.P. Morgan dreamed of controlling systems. He once said, "I don't want a hobby. I want a kingdom." In 1857, when J.P. Morgan was just 20 years old, he started working in New York City at a firm called Duncan, Sherman & Company, which was the American representative of his father's banking firm in London. This was no ordinary job. From day one, J.P. Morgan was surrounded by billion-dollar conversations, international trades, risky investments, and powerful men. And young Morgan didn't just listen. He watched, he studied. He learned how fear and confidence moved the market. He learned that numbers don't lie. People do. And most importantly, he learned that in finance, the real power doesn't come from having money. It comes from making others believe you are the only one who can save them. His personality: cold, sharp, calculated. Even at a young age, people said J.P. Morgan's presence was powerful. He had a commanding voice, deep eyes, and a face that scared most people. He walked into rooms like he owned them, even when he didn't. He hated weakness. He hated indecision. He hated anything that was not perfect. His clothes were flawless. His cigars were imported. His watches were precise. And his beliefs were unbreakable. While America was busy fighting the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, J.P. Morgan was fighting his own silent war, the war of reputation. He made his first controversial move, He bought 5,000 rifles from the government at $3.50 each, and then sold them back to the government for $22 each. Yes, he made a massive profit, but many people saw this as greed and disloyalty. Was it ethical? Was it cruel? We will not answer. We are only telling the story. But this deal gave J.P. Morgan his first real title in finance: the man who knows how to make the system work for him. The real start of the empire. Drexel, Morgan & Co. After the war, in 1871, J.P. Morgan partnered with Anthony Drexel of Philadelphia to form Drexel, Morgan & Company. This was not just a bank. It was a power base. It became the most powerful private banking house in America. Morgan began investing in railroads, steel companies, electric companies, telegraph companies. But he didn't just invest money. He took control of these businesses. If a company was failing, he would step in, fire the managers, replace the leadership, and restructure the company in his own image. This practice was called Morganization, meaning fix it the Morgan way or it dies. And guess what? It worked. Morgan saved railroads, banks, and industries from collapse, but always made himself more powerful in the process. J.P. Morgan believed in something different. Never invest in a business. Invest in the man who runs it. And if the man is weak, replace him. He didn't like competition. He didn't like disorder. He wanted one strong man at the top. Him. But what about his personal life? J.P. Morgan married Amelia Sturgis in 1865. She was the love of his life. But tragically, just 4 months after their marriage, she died of tuberculosis. Morgan was devastated. He never emotionally recovered. He remarried later and had 4 children. But he was never truly happy again. He hid his pain behind business, money, and power. And his rosacea, the disease he had from childhood, worsened. He grew a large, disfigured nose and hated photographs. That's why very few pictures of him smiling exist. In the late 1800s, railroads were the lifeblood of America. They carried people, steel, coal, cotton, everything that made the U.S. powerful. But there was a problem. Too many small rail companies were fighting, losing money, overbuilding, and competing like wild animals. The entire system was on the edge of collapse. And who stepped in to fix it? J.P. Morgan. He didn't just loan money to railroads. He restructured them. He forced peace between competitors. He merged weak companies, removed corrupt executives, and brought in strong leadership. This method became so famous people called it Morganization. One of his biggest moves was in 1885, the famous Albany Meeting. 2 major railroad giants, the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, were about to destroy each other with price wars. Morgan invited both sides to a private meeting on his luxurious yacht. He locked the doors. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He simply said, "You will either cooperate, or you will both die." Within hours, the deal was done. War stopped. Peace was made. And Morgan became the undisputed king of railroads in America. By the 1890s, he controlled over 60% of all railway lines in the United States. Let that sink in. One man controlled most of America's transportation system. But Morgan wasn't just interested in trains. He wanted to control the entire structure of American capitalism. So he began expanding his reach into electric companies, telegraph companies, steel mills, banks. In 1891, he helped finance Thomas Edison's electric company, and merged it into what would later become General Electric, GE, one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Morgan was no longer just a man. He was now a machine of capital. In 1893, America faced one of the worst financial crises in its history. The stock market crashed. Banks were closing. People were scared. The U.S. government itself was running out of gold. Yes, the government. The situation was so bad that the U.S. dollar, which was backed by gold, was losing trust. If gold reserves dropped too low, the dollar would collapse, and with it, the entire economy. The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, had no idea what to do. So who did he call? J.P. Morgan. On a cold February morning in 1895, Morgan walked into the White House, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as a savior. He told President Cleveland, "I will give you $62 million worth of gold. In exchange, I want a private bond sale, with interest." This was not charity. This was a deal. Morgan saved the economy and made a fortune from it. Within weeks, gold reserves were restored, the dollar was saved, the panic was stopped, and the message was clear. When the government fails, J.P. Morgan will fix it, but he will never do it for free. Some newspapers were shocked. Some politicians were angry. How could one private man have more power than the U.S. government? But others whispered, "Thank God Morgan exists." After 1895, J.P. Morgan's name became legend. But legends come with fear. The public began asking, is this man too powerful? Can he control our lives? Who voted for him? Can a private banker become more powerful than a president? But Morgan didn't care. He never answered critics. He simply focused on the next deal. Behind all this power, Morgan lived like a king. He owned art collections worth millions. His house on Madison Avenue was like a museum. He had private clubs, private trains, private yachts. He smoked 20 cigars a day. He spoke only to people who mattered. And if you wasted his time, he would stand up and leave. He hated reporters. He hated photographers. He once threatened to beat a journalist with his cane for taking a photo without permission. His rosacea had worsened, and he grew more paranoid about his appearance. He didn't want fame. He wanted order. J.P. Morgan lived by a few strong rules. A man I do not trust cannot get money from me, not for all the bonds in Christendom. He trusted people, not paper. I owe the public nothing. He didn't care what others thought. He served his system. Credit is only a matter of confidence. He believed that fear collapses economies and confidence builds them. To him, money was not numbers. It was power, respect, and control. By the end of the 1890s, J.P. Morgan had done everything. Controlled railroads, saved the government, tamed electric companies, silenced critics. Part 2. The birth of U.S. Steel and the most powerful man in America. The late 1800s and early 1900s were the age of steel. Steel built skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, ships, weapons, factories. Steel was strength. Steel was modernity. Steel was the future. Whoever controlled steel controlled the backbone of America. There were many steel companies, but one name ruled them all: Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who came from poverty, a self-made industrial giant, a man who worked obsessively, a man whose steel mills were unmatched. Carnegie Steel was worth more than any other industrial empire in the United States. And J.P. Morgan knew one thing: he could never dominate America unless he dominated steel. Let's understand the difference between these two men. Andrew Carnegie emotional, proud, energetic, charismatic, loved being seen, believed in giving away money, wanted to be remembered as a kind man. J.P. Morgan, cold, calculating, silent, controlled, hated publicity, believed in power, order, structure, wanted stability, not applause. They were opposites in every way, and opposites almost never work together. But history was going to bring them face to face. By 1900, Morgan had reorganized railroads, electricity, banks, and industrial companies. He now had a level of control no private man ever had before. But Carnegie was not afraid of him. In fact, Carnegie enjoyed teasing Morgan. When reporters asked Carnegie, "Would you ever sell your company to J.P. Morgan?" Carnegie laughed and said, "No, I don't want to see my empire under someone else's umbrella." People loved it. Carnegie became the friendly giant. Morgan became the mysterious power figure. But Morgan knew that Carnegie's steel empire was stopping him from completing his own vision. Morgan wanted to build something the world had never seen. The first billion-dollar corporation in history. To do that, he needed Carnegie Steel. And to get Carnegie Steel, he needed something even bigger. The courage to walk into a meeting where he might be humiliated. In 1900 to 1901, American industries were rising fast. Competitors were growing. Smaller steel companies wanted protection. They wanted stability. And they knew only one man could bring order, J.P. Morgan. So smaller steel firms came to Morgan and said, "Bring us together, make us strong, but we cannot beat Carnegie without you." Morgan knew this was the moment. He organized dozens of steel companies. He prepared financial plans. He studied Carnegie's empire piece by piece. Then something happened that changed history. Carnegie, now aging, went on a vacation to Scotland. During that trip, Carnegie wrote a small note with a number. The price he would sell his entire steel empire for. A number so high most men would faint. Carnegie handed this note to his business partner Charles Schwab and said, "If Morgan agrees, I will sell." It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. Charles Schwab traveled back to America and met J.P. Morgan in his private library. Morgan sat quietly. Schwab handed Morgan the piece of paper with Carnegie's price. Morgan read the number, looked up, and simply said, "Tell Mr. Carnegie I accept." No fight, no argument, no drama. Two of the most powerful men in American history agreed on the largest business deal ever made, with nothing more than a silent handshake. Just like that, Andrew Carnegie became one of the richest men in the world, and J.P. Morgan became something even bigger, the owner of America's steel backbone. In 1901, Morgan combined Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, National Steel, American Steel and Wire, and dozens of smaller firms. And he created United States Steel Corporation, known as U.S. Steel. It became the first company in world history worth over $1 billion, over $40 billion today. This was not just a business achievement. This was a global earthquake. For the first time, a private corporation had more financial power than many countries. U.S. Steel employed hundreds of thousands of workers, controlled 1/3 of America's steel, had influence in every city, became the backbone of bridges, trains, buildings, and weapons. And who stood at the top? J.P. Morgan. Without raising his voice, without appearing on stage, without giving one speech, he built the largest financial empire the world had ever seen. The world was stunned. Newspapers wrote, "A new king rules America." Is Morgan more powerful than the government? No man has ever controlled so much. This is the age of the Morgan Empire. Some people believed Morgan saved industries. Some believed he was too powerful. Some believed he was dangerous. Some believed he was a genius. But Morgan didn't care who believed what. His goal was simple: create order, build stability, remove chaos, and U.S. Steel was proof he could do it. Morgan never visited steel factories. He didn't stand near furnaces. He didn't walk inside mills. What he did was different. He controlled the managers, the boardrooms, the finances, the expansions, the strategies, the competition. He believed in one thing: a leader should be above the noise, not inside it. He let the experts run the steel mills. He ran the system. Behind his growing empire, Morgan's personal world remained complicated. His face was heavily disfigured from rosacea, making him more private. He refused photos unless absolutely necessary. He lived surrounded by art, books, rare jewels. He bought medieval tapestries, paintings, manuscripts. His home was filled with treasures, like a European royal palace. He traveled across Europe collecting unique objects. He surrounded himself with the world's best advisors. He spent hours every day reading letters, financial reports, and notes. He lived simply in some ways, and grandly in others. He ate quickly. He spoke in short sentences. He hated crowds. He hated noise. He loved silence and control. But he loved one thing more than anything: order. His mind needed structure. His world needed discipline. His companies needed organization. And that is why so many businesses trusted him. As U.S. Steel became unstoppable, people began to worry. Reporters wrote articles accusing Morgan of controlling railroads, controlling electricity, controlling steel, controlling banks, and even controlling the government. This fear gave birth to a new word: the money trust. Many believed Morgan had too much influence. Politicians began questioning: can one private banker control the entire U.S. economy? Is this safe? Should the government stop him? Is this capitalism or monarchy? Morgan stayed silent. He didn't answer critics. He didn't give interviews. He didn't explain himself. He believed a man who is right does not need to shout. But the political storm was coming. And soon, Morgan would face another crisis, one even bigger than the Panic of 1893. A crisis that would push him to the center of American history once again. A crisis that would make people realize, when the U.S. economy collapses, one man must step forward. And that man was still J.P. Morgan. He was not a king, not a president, not elected by anyone. But still, people said, nothing happens in America unless J.P. Morgan allows it. And that belief, true or not, gave Morgan power. But soon, that power would be tested like never before. Because something dark was coming: a financial panic, a silent disaster, a moment when the entire U.S. economy almost collapsed. And J.P. Morgan would have to save the country. Again. The early 1900s looked strong on the surface. Industries were booming. People were investing in stocks. Big banks were lending money. Railroads were expanding. New millionaires were rising. But behind the scenes, there was chaos. Small banks were borrowing too much. Investors were gambling on high-risk stocks. Fake companies were being created. People were chasing fast money, not real value. And suddenly, the bubble popped. In October 1907, the stock market began to crash. Banks began running out of money. People rushed to withdraw their savings. Businesses couldn't pay their workers. Factories began shutting down. And soon, the fear spread like fire. It was a true panic. But there was one problem. America didn't have a central bank. There was no Federal Reserve at that time. So the government looked around and realized the only man powerful enough to save us is J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was now 70 years old. He was not young. He was not healthy. But his mind was sharper than ever. He was in his private library in New York City when the panic began. People rushed to him. Bankers, industrialists, government officials, business leaders. Everyone begged him, "Mr. Morgan, please, the country needs you." And like a commander walking back onto the battlefield, Morgan stood up. He closed his doors. He canceled his meetings. He lit a cigar and said, "Bring me the facts." Morgan began working like a machine. He created a war room inside his library. He brought in experts, accountants, bankers, lawyers, CEOs. He placed chairs in circles. He spread out financial statements on the table. He asked detailed questions about every failing bank. For 3 days and 3 nights, he barely slept. He studied every number. He wanted to know which banks were truly weak, which companies were lying, which loans could still be recovered, which men could be trusted. And once he understood the full picture, he took action. On the evening of October 22nd, 1907, Morgan invited all the top bankers in New York City to his library. He looked around the room and said, "You caused this mess. Now you will help fix it." Some bankers resisted. They didn't want to lend money. They didn't want to risk their own banks to save others. Morgan said nothing. Instead, he stood up, walked to the doors, and locked them. Yes, he literally locked the doors of his library from the outside. Then he said, "No one leaves this room until we agree." For hours, the bankers argued. Some yelled, some begged. But Morgan sat silently, reading a book. At midnight, he looked up and said, "Gentlemen, you have 10 minutes to sign." Under pressure, the bankers signed the agreement. They pledged $25 million to support failing banks and businesses. In today's money, over $800 million. The next morning, newspapers reported, "Morgan saves Wall Street. Crisis averted. Thanks to J.P. Morgan." J.P. Morgan had just done something extraordinary. He had analyzed the entire national banking system, organized the top bankers into action, supplied emergency funds from private sources, restored confidence in the markets, prevented a complete collapse of the U.S. economy. And he did it all, without any political title, without any military force, without asking for fame, without making a speech. He did it because no one else could. But this time, something changed. The people were grateful, but they were also terrified. Newspapers and politicians started asking, why should we depend on one man to save our country? What if Morgan died tomorrow? What if he refused next time? Shouldn't America have its own system, not one man's mercy? This fear gave birth to a powerful movement, a movement to create a real national central bank. This movement eventually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, a permanent institution to manage U.S. money, interest rates, and financial stability. In short, J.P. Morgan's power was so big that America created a new system just to replace him. Part 3. The Government versus J.P. Morgan, the Empire under Attack. J.P. Morgan had saved America from financial disaster, twice. He had built industries, merged companies, and created order in a chaotic economy. He had done what governments could not do. He had become more than a man. He had become a system. But in the early 1900s, America began to change. And for the first time, the government started asking a dangerous question. Should one man have this much power? This part of the story is not about building. It's about defending. It's about how J.P. Morgan, now old, tired, and disrespected, had to face public trials, political attacks, and the beginning of the end of his financial empire. When Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States in 1901, he brought a new energy to Washington. He was young. He was bold. He wanted to fight corruption. And he had a mission: break the trusts. Trusts were large business combinations, like Morgan's U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, Northern Securities. The public had started to believe that these massive corporations were too big, too powerful, and unfair to ordinary people. J.P. Morgan's name was at the top of that list. So, just 2 years after Morgan saved the country from the panic of 1907, the same country turned around and said, "We want to break your empire." And they came for him hard. Let's go back a little. In 1901, J.P. Morgan had made another giant move. He helped create a company called Northern Securities, which combined multiple major railroads: Northern Pacific, Great Northern, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Together, this new company controlled almost all the railroads in the northwestern U.S. It was massive. And it was legal, at least under the laws of the time. But President Roosevelt didn't care. He believed this was a monopoly, too much power, too dangerous. So he sued J.P. Morgan's company using a new law, the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was the first time the U.S. government had ever taken such a powerful business leader to court. When Morgan heard about the lawsuit, he was shocked. He had always worked with the government. He had saved the economy. He believed the government trusted him. So he met with Roosevelt's team and said something unforgettable. "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up. That is business." What he meant was, we solve problems privately, not in public. Why are you trying to humiliate me? But this time, the government said, no. This time, it's public. Morgan couldn't believe it. He had spent his life bringing order to chaos, but now he was being treated like a criminal. The court case went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1903. For months, lawyers debated. Was Northern Securities a monopoly? Did it reduce competition? Did it hurt the public? The country was watching. Wall Street was watching. Morgan was watching silently, from the shadows. In the end, the Supreme Court ruled against J.P. Morgan. The Northern Securities Company was broken up. It was a shocking moment. The most powerful man in American business had been defeated, not by money, but by law. After the case, the newspapers changed their tone. They no longer called Morgan a savior. Now they called him the man behind the curtain, the invisible hand controlling America, the king of monopolies. Political cartoons showed Morgan as a giant octopus with his arms around the railroads, the banks, the steel industry, and even Congress. The same people who once said, "Thank God for J.P. Morgan," now said, "We must protect the country from J.P. Morgan." Even after the court loss, Morgan continued to fight for control. He reorganized his companies. He invested in new industries. He expanded internationally, especially into Europe and Latin America. He helped finance large public projects like the Panama Canal and global shipping routes. And still, he maintained control over U.S. Steel, General Electric, AT&T International Mercantile Marine, and dozens of smaller firms. But something inside him was changing. He was tired, older, less interested in the day-to-day fighting. He had spent 50 years building an empire. Now he spent his days defending it. In 1912, a powerful investigation was launched by the U.S. Congress. It was called the Pujo Committee. Their goal was to investigate the so-called money trust. They wanted to prove that J.P. Morgan and a small group of bankers had created a secret network that controlled America's economy. And so, for the first and only time, J.P. Morgan was called to testify before Congress. Morgan was now in his mid-70s. He was heavier, slower, still intimidating, but clearly aging. In the courtroom, Morgan sat in a chair surrounded by lawyers and reporters. And then, the questioning began. One of the committee members asked, "Mr. Morgan, is it not true that banks loan money based on property and assets?" Morgan answered, "No, sir. The first thing is character. Before money or property, we ask, is this man honest? Can he be trusted?" This one sentence shocked the room. Morgan wasn't just talking about banking. He was talking about the foundation of trust. But the public didn't care anymore. They wanted blood. They wanted control to return to the government. After months of investigation, the committee published its results. They found that J.P. Morgan and a few other bankers had control over 112 directorships in 47 major corporations, companies worth over $22 billion in early 1900s dollars. They said this was dangerous, undemocratic, too much concentration of power. They recommended major changes in how banks and businesses operate. This investigation was the final push that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, new banking regulations, greater government oversight of Wall Street. Morgan didn't fight the new changes. He had seen the future. He knew that the age of personal financial empires was ending. He had lived during a time when one man could control a nation's economy. But now the people wanted systems, not saviors. He returned to his private life, spent more time in Europe, spent his last months reading, writing, and reflecting. He was not angry. He was simply done. Part 4. The Final Days of J.P. Morgan. Death, Legacy, and the System That Still Lives. The year is 1913. J.P. Morgan, the man who once controlled American finance like a chessboard, is now an old man, not defeated, not broken, but tired, wounded by time, and silently watching the world change around him. He had already built and defended his empire. Now all that remained was reflection. And deep inside, even J.P. Morgan knew, I will die, but the structure I built will live forever. In his final months, J.P. Morgan spent most of his time in Europe. He stayed in Rome, Paris, London, and Monte Carlo. Not for luxury, but for peace. He had built for decades railroads, steel empires, banks, financial rescue plans, business deals that shaped countries. But now, he was reading books, visiting art galleries, walking slowly through cathedrals, staring at ancient statues, and thinking about everything. His health was failing. His skin was deeply affected by rosacea. His eyesight was poor. His energy was low. He suffered from headaches and fatigue. His breathing became difficult. His heart was weakening. But his mind was still sharp as a sword. In March 1913, J.P. Morgan traveled to Rome. He stayed at the Grand Hotel Plaza, one of the oldest and finest hotels in the city. There he met friends, diplomats, bankers, and art dealers. But something was different this time. He seemed more quiet than usual, more thoughtful. almost as if he was saying goodbye without using the words. He spent long hours alone in his suite. He did not talk much. He stared at the window. Sometimes he wrote letters. Sometimes he just sat in silence. And then, on the morning of March 31st, 1913, John Pierpont Morgan died peacefully in his room. No struggle, no noise. Just a quiet end to the life of a man who shaped nations. He was 75 years old. The death of J.P. Morgan was international news. Headlines around the world reported, J.P. Morgan dead, giant of finance passes away in Rome. The master of Wall Street is gone. A chapter in American industry ends. Morgan dies, but his empire remains. In New York, the stock exchange closed for 2 hours in his honor. That was something they only did for presidents. Crowds gathered outside the Morgan Library in Manhattan. People stood in silence. Not everyone admired him, but everyone respected him. His body was brought back to America. A private funeral was held in New York. No grand speeches, no golden tombs, no royal ceremonies. Just a quiet farewell from family, close friends, and business leaders. People didn't cry loudly. They just watched in silence as the man who once controlled the world's money was lowered into the ground. Many were curious. How rich was J.P. Morgan when he died? He had helped create billion-dollar companies. He had controlled railroads, steel, electricity, finance. He had saved the U.S. economy twice, so people expected him to be the richest man in the world. But they were shocked. His personal fortune was around $80 million. That was a huge amount, but much less than people expected. Less than Rockefeller, less than Carnegie. Why? Because J.P. Morgan never chased personal wealth. He chased power, order, and legacy. He once said, "Money is only a tool. The goal is stability. The reward is trust." Before his death, J.P. Morgan had created something more meaningful than any office: the Morgan Library. It was not just a library. It was a temple of knowledge and culture. Inside were ancient manuscripts, first editions of the Bible, letters from kings, queens, and presidents, original works by Mozart, Beethoven, and Michelangelo, paintings by Rembrandt, Botticelli, and Raphael, books no one else in the world had, and he left it not for his family, but for the public. He opened the Morgan Library as a gift to America. He wanted people to think deeply, read widely, and see beauty. This was J.P. Morgan's way of saying, if you want to understand power, understand history. Today, the Morgan Library and Museum is still open in New York, a place where anyone can walk in and touch the past. After his death, his banking firm J.P. Morgan and Company continued growing. It became one of the most respected institutions in the world. The bank that advised presidents, kings, and governments. A financial engine for World War I. A place where global finance was coordinated. And in the year 2000, it merged with Chase Manhattan to become J.P. Morgan Chase. Today, it is the largest bank in the United States, with trillions of dollars in assets. The name J.P. Morgan is still on buildings, stock tickers, news headlines, every single day. He is gone, but his signature still signs the economy. J.P. Morgan was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a system in human form. From his life, the world learned. 1. The power of trust. He never begged. He never shouted. His power came from confidence, in himself and in others. Credit is the trust of the people. Lose it, and you lose everything. 2. The importance of character. Even when he made billion-dollar decisions, he looked at one thing. Is this man honest? That was his rule. Even more than profit. 3. Silence is power. He never gave speeches. He never wanted fame. He worked quietly, but his results shouted across the world. 4. Don't just make money, make structure. Morgan didn't just invest. He rebuilt, reorganized, stabilized. He fixed broken systems. He created order in chaos. 5. Never panic in a panic. During financial disasters, he remained calm while others screamed. And because of that calmness, the entire country followed him. J.P. Morgan never wrote an autobiography. He never told the world what he felt inside. But those who knew him closely said, he didn't love money. He loved systems. He didn't chase luxury. He chased order. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to build something that would last beyond him. And he did. He built companies, laws, trust, ideas, and a financial network that still runs the world today. Now the journey is complete. From a sick boy in Connecticut to a global financial giant, from building railroads to saving the U.S. economy, from court battles to creating institutions still alive today, from a man feared by presidents to a name that stands for stability. This was not a story of good or evil. It was a story of impact. And even now, over 100 years later, the world still runs on systems that J.P. Morgan built. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, helped you learn English, or made you think deeply, subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember this: you don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to be perfect to be remembered. You just need to build something that lasts.